right, so good morning, everyone. So today we are very pleased to have Brendan TB from Lincoln. So he's going to talk about long run effect of America's first paid maternity leave policy. So Brendan, so you have like 1 hour. So yeah, given you have a long talk, so we were trying to hold our question towards the end. So usually we have like 10 to 15 minutes discussion towards the end. All right. Thank you so much for your coming. So let me stop sharing and then so you can share your slide. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. All right, can you see my slides?
Yes, great.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks a lot for having me. And okay, I'll try to be relatively quick to save time. Although again, please don't hesitate to stop me during the talk either if you want. Yeah, so this project is called the Long Run Effects of America's First Paid Maternity Leave Policy. I do have to say up front, because there are some results in here that come from restricted census data, that these are my own opinions and conclusions and not those of the Census Bureau. And these results have been reviewed to make sure there's no confidential information disclosed. So have to get that out of the way. But with that aside, I just want to talk for the next hour or so about the topic of parental leave. And, I think this is an important topic because, it's really become an increasingly common feature of the labor market over the last few decades, right? And here in the US, there's an active campaign to expand the availability of paid leave. And you often hear it said during this debate that, the US is the only country in the developed world without a paid maternity leave policy. So one of the things I'm here to tell you is that that's not entirely the case, right? In fact, we have some policies that haven't been fully studied yet, and that I think are important to study, in part because expanding paid leave is something that's attracted attention from a wide range of quarters, right? A lot of people interested in this. And despite all this interest from policymakers and the public, there's really the academic literature has had trouble generating compelling evidence on a couple of basic questions about parental leave. Right? So the first one is, what are the impacts on women's outcomes in the labor market? Right. So we'll hear proponents of paid leave argue that paid leave policies allow women to have some flexibility, come back to a job after childbirth, and that's going to promote gender equity by encouraging women to remain attached to the labor force. But we really don't have a lot of great evidence on this, and in fact, a recent review that I pulled out a quote here concluded that there's just really no obvious consensus on the labor market impact of parental leave. The second open question is, how do these policies affect kids in the long run? Right. So here again, we hear proponents argue that, well, if you give parents more flexibility, they can, they'll invest more time in their kids at a critical stage of development, and that will lead to increases in human capital accumulation and health and so forth, and that can have long run positive impacts on kids. But here again, we just don't really have a lot of evidence. And another review of the parental leave literature, very recent, argued that there's not much known about these possible consequences on long-run child welfare, especially in the US context. Now, I want to emphasize that one of the reasons we don't have a lot of evidence is because, if you study these policies, you want to find some sort of policy change that you can use to estimate some causal effect, right? And in the US, we just don't have a whole lot of policy, right? There's a lot of policy variation, excuse me. We have things like the FMLA, but these affect a relatively small and highly selected group of women. And there are a few states that have enacted paid leave policies, but of course, those were so recent that if we want to see the long run effects on kids, we're going to have to wait another decade or two to see how this plays out. Okay, so that's where this paper comes in, where I'm hoping this makes a contribution. One of the things I do here is I put together a new identification strategy that's based on a historical expansion of paid leave through short-term disability insurance. Okay, and I'll get into a little more detail in just a minute about how this happened, but basically you can think of this policy as it arrived in different states at different times and in different intensities. Okay, so my research design here is going to compare, you can think of comparing people from the same state before and after the policy, and across different states where the policy had more bite in some places than others. Okay, so I'm going to use this variation and I'm going to think about, okay, what are the impacts on women's labor market outcomes? And then secondly, what are the impacts on kids in the long run? Okay, so that's kind of the research design in a nutshell. And just to give you a quick preview of what I find that, sure enough, you enact this policy and women did take it up quite substantially. And it did lead to more taking of leave, right? So women, my preferred estimate here, the kind of best estimate I think I can come up with is that women who got these benefits took another 5 or 6 weeks away from work after a new child was born. However, I also find that this appeared to come with some costs, right? In addition to this flexibility that women got, it appears to have had some effects on the labor market where I see, a pretty persistent and pretty robust effect of a decrease in wages among women of childbearing age, which I'm defining here as 18 to 45. That in turn led to a decrease in family income among women. And that raises this question about kids, right? Because of course, while we might see we might see some effects that I mentioned earlier about, right, effects on health and human capital of these critical investments at a critical period. We also know family income is an important component sort of in the human capital production function, if you will. And so that can potentially have some downstream effects on kids. And indeed, I look at these kids after they've grown up. Kids whose mothers were exposed to these policies appear to have accumulated less education. So they're about 1.9% less likely to attend college and about 3% less likely to earn a 4-year degree. Okay, so that's kind of my results, the paper in a nutshell. Unless there are any questions, I'll sort of dig into this story of this first paid, what I'm calling the first paid maternity leave policy. Okay, so there are a lot of different ways you can design parental leave policies, right? The one I'm talking about today is specifically comes through what's known as short-term disability insurance. Okay, so if you're not familiar with short-term disability insurance, this is not something that was originally designed as a vehicle for paid leave. It was really designed, for factory workers that can't report to work because they broke their leg on the weekend or something like that, right? This is income replacement, designed as income replacement for workers. It's got its start in the 19th century, got much more popular until throughout the first half of the 20th century, and by mid 20th century, about 48% of workers across the U.S. Had this through an employer. So you can think about half of workers having some sort of policy. The exception is in 5 states that have enacted laws that made short-term disability insurance virtually universal. Okay. And these state laws were passed between 1942 and 1969. So this really happened long before short-term disability insurance had anything to do, or long before short-term disability insurance had anything to do with paid leave. We have this cross-sectional variation across the US where we have some states where everybody has it, other states, where anywhere from a quarter to about 40% of workers. And actually, this is my estimate of how many female workers between ages 18 and 45 had access to this through an employer, right? So about in some states as low as a quarter, up to about 41%, and then in these darkest blue states here, these are the places where these policies were universal. Okay, so how did this? So that's sort of this cross-sectional background. Now, how did it become affiliated with parental leave? Well, what happened is in the 1960s and 1970s, a number of states and eventually the federal government started passing laws that banned discrimination against workers on the basis of pregnancy. Okay, so these laws kind of varied across places and they arrived at different times, but it basically looked sort of like this. So it started out, Rhode Island was the first state to do this. New Jersey followed in 1961. And then if we fast forward to the 70s, it really started picking up where we get more and more states adopting these policies until the picture looked something like this in 1978, okay? That's when the federal government, the Congress stepped in and passed the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. Okay, now again, like I said, these varied from place to place. In some states, they were passed by the legislatures. In other places, they were passed by state courts. And then in all these gray states here, this was an act of Congress. So these laws varied from place to place, but what they had in common was that they required short-term disability insurance policies to cover pregnancy as a disability. Okay, and this is still in effect today. A lot of women get paid leave through this legal requirement. And so effectively what we have here is America's first paid maternity leave policy. Okay, and of course, it arrived in different states at different times, and some states, more women are affected than others. So that's the variation I'm going to be using. So what you might ask, okay, what did this mean for these women who got access to paid leave through short-term disability insurance? Well, again, this also varied from place to place, but the benefits were actually relatively modest. Okay, maybe the typical case was anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks of wage replacement benefits, right? And this would cover between half and 2/3 of your usual wages up to some cap. Okay, so these were fairly modest benefits. Although I would say, these are actually not that far out of line with proposals we've seen in recent years in Congress to expand paid leave universally, right? So so one thing is this, I think one nice thing about this setting is it affected a wide swath of women, and also, with fairly modest benefits that are fairly similar to what we might see if we were to enact something today. They also came with what I'm calling soft job protection. Okay, so these laws did not require any certain employer to offer paid leave benefits to their workers. What it did say is that, hey, if you offer your workers short-term disability insurance, you need to cover pregnancy or childbirth, just like you'd cover, some guy who broke his leg on the weekend, right? So you have to cover pregnancy just like a similarly debilitating condition that anyone else might suffer. Okay, so and so if that included reinstatement rights, which often it did, then these women also got access to a job guarantee for the term of their leave. Okay, so that's what it meant for women. Now, what did it mean for employers on the other hand, right? So employers, of course, you might think would bear some of the cost of this. Now, the expected cost of the benefits were also fairly modest, right, in terms of the specific costs, right? So this is if I just do a little exercise with the CPS, thinking about the share of women in this age group who have a child every year and their annual earnings, I come up with the expected cost for a female worker would be about 0.5% of her annual earnings. But of course, that might not be the only cost, right? And in fact, if you dig back into some of the newspaper accounts of the day and the congressional record of the day, so this is from the congressional record when they were debating the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. We have this representative of the Electronic Industries Association that was arguing, of course, arguing that this is going to be costly to workers. And he says, not only is it the cost of providing the actual benefits, but there are other costs which he thinks it may have been overlooked. One of which is productivity costs, right? If a woman goes on leave, they're going to have to find replacement workers, and they're not as experienced and not as productive as their regular workers. Okay, and he says, we feel that providing disability benefits will result in longer leaves. And then also there's going to be replacement costs. They also express this worry that that this would bring women into the workforce. Women would be more likely to come and work from them, but then leave. They, for example, would claim their benefits and then never come back to work. And so turnover costs might also go up. And so this is another cost that employers raised, hassle costs, lower productivity of these temporary workers, and higher turnover. This is a little harder to quantify, but work from, for example, Alan Manning trying to quantify turnover costs suggests that they can actually be quite high, right? And I unfortunately don't have that slide here, but suffice it to say that sort of the shadow cost of this policy could be fairly high from the perspective of firms. Okay, so that's the background. So again, to lay out my empirical strategy here, again, what I'm going to do is use this variation in the timing of policies and in the bite of the policy. So you can if you want to think about this graphically, you can think about a certain state where I've plotted this is just a schematic. This is not real data, but you can think about plotting the time path of take up of paid leave within a given state, and on the horizontal axis here I have time relative to the adoption of this policy. Right, and so it might be going along at some rate, and then we would expect at time 0 here, the first year of the policy, that take up might rise, and then it might even continue to rise, right, as people learn about the policy. Then we can think about comparing that to a state, right? So we can think about comparing before and after within this state. We can also think about comparing the before and after for a state where short-term disability insurance coverage is higher, right? And that might look something, there we go. That might look something like this, right? In a state where they have a larger dose of short-term of paid leave because of this pre-existing, higher share of workers covered by short-term disability insurance, we would expect to see a bigger bump. Okay, so this is sort of in a visual sense what I'm going to be doing with my empirical strategy. Okay, specifically, I'm going to be estimating some event study, using an event study framework that looks like this. So you can think.
Excuse me.
Oh, yep.
So let me ask you a quick question.
Yeah.
So now I can see. So you really look at long term. So just quickly. So how many years you look at after 1970?
After 19. So it depends on the data set. So I'm going to use two main data sets here that I'll show you. One of which is the CPS. There I can only see hourly wages back to 1973. Okay, so I'm going to use 1973 through 1987. So I'll get to see a pretty lengthy post period there.
Okay. So that's a question. So actually, so my question is, if you look at really long term, and just keep in mind in 1970, actually starting from after World War II, so there are like two significant change in labor market. One is regarding to the females labor force participation. The other is the fertility rate change. So that may interact with the woman's paid leave decision, no?
Yeah, I think definitely right. So I think that's exactly right. This is definitely a time when women's labor force participation during the 70s, labor force participation rising substantially.
And the fertility rate drops, right?
And the fertility rate, yeah. So the fertility rate is falling. It peaked in about 59 or 60. There's a little bit of a notch in 1970, and then but it's still falling sort of at the beginning of my time period. So what I'm going to be using here is, so I think that's exactly right. That's definitely in the background, and so if you think about my empirical strategy here, I think that would, so what I'd really be worried about, I think, is if there was some sort of shock, right, in the fertility rate or in labor force participation that's not related to disability insurance or paid leave, but is correlated with the way this rolled out. And so one of the things I do, I think I have a couple of these here, is I do look at a few, I do a few exercises where I take this event study framework, and then I look at some other outcomes. Like I look at fertility rates. I look at, what else do I look at? I look at, I think I forget exactly. I could show them to you if you want to see them, but basically it's exactly what you're thinking. I think that's exactly right. I would be really worried if I saw some coincident shock to some other variable that might be a determinant of women's wages. And I don't really find anything that points to any sort of confounding effect there. But if you want to see those, I think I have it set up so I can take a little detour into those event studies, and I'd love to talk about that more if you have more thoughts about things that might be confounding these effects here. Is that?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great point. So again, I don't want to rush through the event study in case, just want to make this clear. So what is this doing? What am I doing here? Well, you can focus on a few pieces of this. Okay, so what we're really interested in here is this variable or this coefficient tau here, right? And what this does is this flexibly traces out the effect on my outcome y in time relative to the enactment of paid leave. Okay, so here this T star S variable is the date of enactment of paid leave in state S, and so I'm looking at time relative to that. And so we can look at patterns, how wages and so forth evolve over that time. Okay, so that's where this difference, this variation in timing comes into play in the timing that this policy was adopted across states. Okay, and then of course we have this variation in the bite of the policy. The bite of the policy comes in with this variable right here that I call STDIS 1970. That's my estimate of the share of female workers who had access to short-term disability insurance in 1970. Okay, so before before these policies were enacted in most states. Okay, so that's going to be a 1 in states where it's universal, and then something less than that in other states, so that we can interpret tau as what we might think the effect of a universal expansion would be. Okay, and then I also include these fixed effects. I have some state fixed effects. I have a region by time fixed effects. Okay, that's census region by time, and that's just if there are sort of differential trends in different parts of the country, that's going to help absorb that in a non-parametric way, and then some some covariates X, which actually don't really make much of a difference, but I of course try adding like age and race and such like that into this specification. Okay, and so what we have to assume here as we were just discussing, what we have to assume is that there's not any other driver of Y, right? That's correlated with this with my event time here, right? So paid leave is the only thing driving changes in the relationship between access to maternity benefits through short-term disability insurance and my outcome Y. Okay, and so then I want to interpret this tau variable as the intent to treat effect of the enactment of paid leave. Okay, so net of all margins of response, this is the effect on outcome Y. Okay, this is important because I don't actually, one thing in the data is I don't actually see who, in most cases, most of the data sets I use, I don't actually see who receives these benefits, which is a limitation. But I also think, what we really want to know here is net of all any sort of general equilibrium response to this policy, what's the impact on women's wages? And so that's what we'll capture with this tau k variable, or this tau k coefficient. Okay. All right. So I'll move on to effects on the labor market, and I just want to lay this out really quickly. How am I thinking about this? Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, right, you might think that people sometimes argue that these paid leave policies will encourage women to remain attached to the labor force. Okay, and specifically mothers to remain attached to the labor force. But there are also, right, potential impacts outside the set of women who are giving birth, right? And specifically, if you think about the set of all women of this age group, age 18 to 45, we could see changes in labor supply, and we could see changes in labor demand. So if we think about just the very basic supply demand framework in the labor market, you might think that, okay, we provide this benefit to women. At least for some women, that's going to make working at any given wage more attractive. And so what we're going to see is this increase in labor supply that's going to tend to increase employment and decrease wages. Okay. At the same time, to the extent that firms see this as a costly benefit, as they at least were arguing in Congress, we could see firms less willing to employ women at any given wage, right? So we're going to see labor demand shift back the other way. That's going to tend to push employment back down, but reinforce this decrease in wages. Okay, so we could see employment go up or down. It sort of depends on whether firms see this as more costly than women see it as a benefit, or vice versa. But in either case, there's sort of a rather unambiguous prediction that women's wages should fall. Okay, so this is basically the Larry Summers model of mandated benefits. If you know that paper from 1989, but this is sort of the way I'm thinking about what these effects, what we might be looking for in terms of effects on women of this age group. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is, as I said before, I'm going to take the CPS. Starting in 1973, you see observations of hourly wages. Okay, and I'm going to focus on these women from age 18 to 45. I sort of follow the literature in making some sample restrictions. But I do want to emphasize here, my sample here is all women of age 18 to 45. I'm not limiting it to mothers. or anything like that. So, because again, I want to be thinking of all women in this age group who might not only who might be whose labor supply might be responding, but also who employers demand for their labor services also might be changing.
So excuse me, Brandon.
Yeah.
So can you just go back to previous slides?
Yeah.
So I understand. So like Larry Summers originally, he also pointed out like different employee may value differently to the mandated benefit, no?
Yeah.
So where that show up in the graph?
Yeah, that doesn't show up here. This is just a very simple, everybody's kind of the same.
So this is like cost shifting basically.
Yeah. I mean, I think you could, you could draw it that way, right? I think you might have like a change in slope instead of just a change in the intercept of the supply function. Does that sound right? Something like that. But I think the main point would carry through, right?
So,
or thinking there's an
so this also just circle back to my earlier question.
Mm-hmm.
So my feeling is, maybe I'm wrong. So my feeling is, so your estimation is probably like a lower bound to what happened. So yeah, so we can talk about that later. So this is these two things link quite together, because there's something fundamentally changed the labor market in 1970 can potentially affect the things you are looking at.
Yeah, well, okay. Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear more about that. A lower bound, because are you thinking about like selection into the labor market or into the workforce?
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, so just something just make it extremely costly for them to take maternity leave, or for them to select into that group.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's a great point. I'd love to talk more about that.
But this slide, this is something different. This is just regarding to, yeah. So because I'm pretty familiar with the Summers, because that paper I was been reading for many times. So, but there's the other point I was trying to make is, so that's going to, so I haven't thought through yet. So, but somehow, because this cost shifting is going to distort the workers' decision, because not everybody value these things the same way.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. No. So yeah. So I'm still thinking. So maybe just wait toward the end.
Okay.
So,
okay. Yeah. No, I'd love to talk about that some more.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, I think you're totally right that this is obviously very stylized right here. And I'm actually going to return to it in just a second, but I think I would be interested to know what you think about, maybe a more complicated.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great point. Okay, right. So this is the setup. And again, my data, I'm going to use all women age 18 to 45. So we're thinking about sort of the effects on, equilibrium employment, equilibrium wages, not just those of mothers. And of course, then we also don't have to think about, selection into motherhood. And those sorts of issues here. Okay, and so this is sort of the main results of the paper here. And so what am I doing here? I have on the horizontal axis here is event time, like in the schematic I showed you earlier, where time 0 is the year in which these policies were passed. Okay, and so I have this event study which lends itself to this little bit of a suggestive test where I don't see any evidence of a differential pre-trend beforehand, but in time 0 I do see this sharp decrease in women's wages that levels off at around 4 to 5%, and appears to be pretty stable. I don't see any effects. So this is just sort of a summary where I pool event time dummies into 3-year bins, so we can kind of lend itself to a table format. So you can see here these effects about 4 to 5% on women. I don't see any effects on employment in the aggregate, and I don't really see any effects on men. Now, one thing that, speaking of, maybe making this a little bit of, thinking a little bit more about how we could make this a richer model of the labor market. Well, one thing you might think from my simple model is that, okay, well, there weren't really any robust changes in employment. or hours worked. I don't show you that here, but there, I also don't see any effect on hours worked. That suggests that, at least, that perhaps there was not a lot of selection into the workforce or differential selection. On the other hand, right, if we think there's a big effect among labor demand, right, we could think about that might suggest some more testable implications. All right. So this is actually something I've sort of newly added to this paper. So I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on this. But the idea here is, right, if we think about firm responses in labor demand, we might think that there would be differential responses on the firm side, right? So specifically in jobs where we think that the cost of absence or the cost of turnover is higher, we would expect to see a bigger response in labor demand for those positions, right? And so one of the things I do here is I think about, okay, well, what could we use to proxy the cost of absence or the cost of turnover? And I come up with three different proxies. Okay, the first of which I use what's called the multi-city study of urban inequality. I'm following a paper that I should have the citation here, but as part of this, one thing they do in this study is they survey employers and they ask them about a bunch of different occupations within their firm, and they say, okay, if you hired a new person for this position, how long would it take for that person to get to their full level of productivity, right? And so it goes anywhere, some of them there's 4 weeks, and in other cases it's 5 years before you're a fully productive, working in that occupation. Okay, so I'll take my sample. I'll take my sample and split it into by occupation into people who are an above and below median, what I'm calling that adjustment cost here, occupations. Okay, a similar idea comes from Claudia Golden's paper on the grand gender convergence, where she talks about how there are these returns to jobs where you work long and inflexible hours, right? And one thing she does in that paper is try and estimate a return to hours worked, where you can think about regressing earnings on weeks worked and hours worked, and you can think about splitting the sample based on occupations where that return to hours work is particularly high. Okay, and then finally, one other way I can think about splitting this sample is just taking the Census Bureau's occupation definitions, splitting it into professional and managerial occupations, and all the rest of them, right? So presumably these professional and managerial occupations are places where it's very costly to the firm if this person is gone, if they're absent for a while, or if they see turnover. Okay, so I do that and then I'm going to re-estimate this event study. Things get a little bit noisier, but I do seem to find across all three of these measures this consistent story where, okay, so here I'm plotting 2 event studies, right? Where the orange line with the triangle markers, that's the effect on the wages of workers who are in high adjustment cost occupations. I see a much larger decrease, an immediate decrease, although of course eventually they sort of cross over one another. I see a similar pattern here if I look at professional occupations and non-professional occupations, and then also something similar across occupations where we have high relative to low hours worked. So this all does seem to fit with this idea that employers saw this as a really costly benefit, and they were able to substitute toward men or to other ways of organizing their labor force in response to this, to these laws requiring that they provide women more flexibility around childbirth. Okay, so then the last thing I do when I'm thinking about these labor market returns is, okay, we might think about, okay, did this have any effect on family income, right? It's particularly if we see that employment didn't really respond all that much, but wages were quite significantly different. Okay, now the CPS sample has only a relatively rough measure of family income, where you get indicators of certain categories of income. And so what I do is I take those categories and I create 0, 1 binary indicators of earning above a certain threshold. Okay, so for example, I'll have a variable family income above 1,000, family income above 2,000, and so forth. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my specification, my event study specification, the same as before, except I'm going to, because this data is much more sparse, I'm going to estimate a restricted version of it, right? Where I'm going to restrict this K variable here, where before I estimated, anywhere from -4 all the way to, I think, 10 or so years after the policy. Now I'm just going to restrict it to a 0 or 1 for before or after. Okay, so this is just essentially, I'm going to restrict this model into a sort of the classic difference in difference model. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is here now on the horizontal axis is family income in thousands of dollars. So you can interpret each of these coefficients as the change in the probability that a family earns at least much that income. Right. So for example, here this is the effect on families earning above $1,000. I don't really see any effect there. If I move over to the right a little bit and look at $7,500, which is another threshold given in the CPS, I do see this negative effect. And then if I sort of fill in the picture all the way across here, you can see then once you get back up to the top of the distribution, I don't see any effect anymore. So there appears to have been this decrease in family income that was really concentrated among middle income families. Okay, this is nominal dollars. And so middle income was around, $12,000, $15,000, somewhere in there. So you can think about these as really the middle income families. Okay, so just to summarize, what do we see? We do see this, I saw this big increase in leave taking after the enactment of these policies, but it appears to have led to this decrease in hourly wages and no changes that I can measure in female employment. And this manifested into a decrease in family income. Okay, so this I think this sort of leads nicely into my second question, right? Because even though this is a policy that's intended to promote gender equity in the labor market, it seems to have exacerbated the gender wage gap and gaps in family income. And again, that sort of leads us to this question of whether what the impact might have been on children. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip through a couple of things here just to, because I think I'm running a little short on time. But let me describe briefly the data I'm going to use here. Okay, so this is where this restricted data comes in, and what I'm going to use is data from the 2000 long form census, okay, and the 2001 to 2016 American Community Survey. Okay, so this gives me measures of educational attainment for a broad swath of the U.S. population, and it provides a very large sample. Okay, what really lends itself to studying this question is that this data has been linked to the Social Security numinant file, okay, which gives you the exact date of birth and the place of birth of all these individuals. Okay, and so what I can do is I can link this to people's county of birth and their exact date of birth. Okay, and once I pool all this data, what I have is data on roughly 1/4 of the U.S. population. Okay, so this gives me a very large sample, which is important because of course these we're thinking about a policy that was enacted at childbirth, and I'm going to be looking at people ages 25 and older. These could be very small effects, right? And so I want to be able to distinguish small effects from zero potentially. Okay, the main outcomes I'm going to focus on here are indicators of educational attainment. So years of schooling, high school graduation, college attendance, and 4-year college graduation. Okay, and then in addition, I'm going to follow the literature in this field and create an index of human capital, or what I'm calling a human capital index. Okay, so basically what I do is I take each of these variables, I standardize them, and then I take an unweighted mean. Okay, and that actually helps give me more statistical power, but it also reduces concerns about multiple testing. So that's the justification for focusing on this. I'll also show you some estimates of on the individual outcomes, and you can sort of downweight those results if you wish, because since I'm testing each outcome there, but the main one here is going to be this human capital index. Okay, so again, these event studies are going to look similar to before. Here, because I have a longer pre-period for these kids, I can estimate a longer event study. And so now what we're looking at is the year of the child's birth relative to the enactment of paid leave. Okay, so these kids that we're seeing here, these are kids whose mothers did not have access to, or at least not guaranteed access to paid leave through short-term disability insurance. I don't really see much evidence of a pre-trend. The first cohort is going to be here at time 0, the first cohort that was born after the enactment. And I see this sharp downturn in children's outcome, educational attainment afterward. Okay, if I add these some census division by birth year fixed effects, it doesn't really change things much. And if I add another common control in the literature, which is 1960 county characteristics interacted with a linear trend in your birth year, it also remains pretty much the same. Okay, and if I were to estimate just a simple difference in difference here, it's going to give me a decrease or an estimate of a negative 0.019. So we'd interpret that as a 1.9% decrease in this standard deviation of this human capital index. Okay, that is highly significant, highly statistically significant. Okay, so as I said, that's a little hard to interpret. So that's why I also want to show you, the effects on the individual outcomes. And so this is just a table of those results, and you can see here that it's really driven sort of at the upper end, right? So there's really no effect on high school graduation rates. Years of schooling fall by about 0.05 or by about 0.4%. And this is where college attendance falls by about 1.9%. College graduation falls by about 3%. Okay. So one thing we might, okay, so these are fairly small effects, but of course this is also a fairly small policy, right? So one thing we might want to do is sort of compare this to other, policy interventions that affect children's outcomes. And so that's what I do here. This is simply comparing this policy to other, well-known and policies that have been found to have significant improvements on kids' outcomes. And so here I'm comparing it to the food stamps program, Head Start, and Medicaid, and of course the effects I'm finding go in the opposite direction. But what I want you to take from here is that the magnitude here is really comparable to the magnitude of these policies that we really think have quite substantial positive effects. So these are actually fairly meaningful impacts. One other thing I just want to mention, I know you like to save the last 15 minutes for conversation, so I just want to make one more point, because I think it's interesting to put these findings sort of in context with the literature, and I think these are surprising findings at first blush, but I think it actually makes a lot of sense if we compare this to some of what the other things that have been found in the literature. Okay, so there's been a lot, there are several papers, of course, that have tried to look at effects on children, and they often find positive effects or null effects. It's a little bit of a mixed bag. But there's really only one closely related paper that I know of that has been able to look at the effects on children, 25 or so years after the policy intervention. And that comes this paper from Carnero and co-authors that was in the JPE in 2015. And it's interesting because this paper actually looked at a similar time frame. This is a policy in Norway in 1977, so it's about the same time frame. It's by European standards, it's a relatively modest policy. It was I believe it was 12 weeks of paid leave that women were given. And so, but they find these very large positive effects on these kids' outcomes. Let's see here. All right, they find positive effects on high school attainment, and they also find positive effects on wages at age 30. Okay, so how do we reconcile these, right? I find these negative effects, they're finding these very positive effects. Well, I think one comes from one interesting possibility comes from the different research designs. So this paper was based on a regression discontinuity, right? Where here's one of the key figures. They're comparing children who were born just after the policy was enacted to children born just before the policy was enacted. And here's where this is the effect they find on the share of kids dropping out of high school. And here's the effect they find on wages at age 30, right? So they see this sharp increase. But I think one, one way to reconcile is this, well, what are they comparing, right? When you do this regression discontinuity, they're comparing, these kids who were born just before or just after. They're really holding a lot of policy relevant margins of response constant, right? So for example, if this policy in Norway had effects on the labor market, on women's outcomes in the labor market, right? That would have been held fixed by the kid born just after and the kid born just before, right? That margin of response would not be captured by the RD. On the other hand, in my case, where I'm estimating these intent to treat effects in a difference in differences setting, I'm really estimating effects, net of all margins of response. Okay, and so I think what reconcile this would be, well, this Carnero paper suggests that, yeah, indeed, this extra time, this extra flexibility, extra parental investments of time at an early age can really have important positive effects on kids that can echo for a long time. On the other hand, they can also have unintended consequences, such as effects on the labor market. And that can have offsetting effects or effects that even drive these policies to be, have sort of negative consequences for these kids in the long run. Okay, so sorry, I went slightly over, but just to sum up, again, the idea of this paper is I really was hoping to find some new evidence, to bring some new evidence to bear on this questions about what would happen when we enact a paid leave policy. What happens to the labor market outcomes of women? What happens to the long run outcomes of kids? Okay, and so I developed this new identification strategy using short-term disability insurance. I find evidence that women's wages fell and that family income among these families also fell. That seems to have had effects downstream on the outcome of the next generation of kids. Right, so this suggests that while we might want to think about these sorts of policies might have important benefits that we would want to consider, we'd also want to consider the possibility that there could be unintended consequences, and we'd want to take those into account in designing any sort of policy in the future. Okay, so I'll stop there. I thank you for your attention and comments, and I'm happy to discuss more.
Thank you so much for your time. So by the way, I apologize, we miscommunicated. So you have 1 hour for your presentation, and we have 10 to 15 minutes discussion. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
That's fine. So anyway, so you already finished. So yeah, thank you so much. So maybe let's see. So maybe we have a question from my colleague. So
I'll resist the temptation to bore you with the details that I skipped.
All right.
Delve back into it,
but I find out so the impact on child's long-term development quite counterintuitive. I'm not sure. So have you compared with Heckman's results? Because maybe just too early, I mean, so this intervention on the children is too early,
Observing,
because essentially, so this policy affects like a few months baby, right? But so typically the literature on early childhood intervention towards slightly older children, no?
Well, I think it depends. There's literature like the or do you want me to stop sharing, or do you want me to?
It's up to you, yeah.
Go back to this, like this, some of these. Well, I guess I don't have it shown here, but some of these, for example, some of these studies of Medicaid expansions and so forth, suggest that even Medicaid coverage, during pregnancy and in the first year can have really big effects on kids. So it seems like, at least my reading of the literature is that even these really early, interventions can have really substantial impacts on kids. The way I think about it is, there's a lot of things going on, right? So if you, I don't find any robust evidence of employment effects, but to the extent that, so if this policy did increase, if policies like this do increase women's attachment to the labor force, the effect on kids is a little bit uncertain, right? Because income, that might mean the family has more income, so they can make more sort of, investments of resources in kids. But that also means, in fact, there's some really interesting papers on the EITC making this point. I forget the citation, but they look at the EITC and they show the EITC brought women to the labor force, increased their income, and it appears to have had positive effects on kids. But they show that actually, if you account for the fact that those moms were spending less time with the kids, right? Like the income, the value of the income is sort of understated by these policies, right? Because moms got more income, they could invest more in kids, but they spent less time with the kids, and the kids, of course, where the alternative environment that those kids would spend, where those kids would spend their time is sort of important there, right? So if depends on, like, are you going to a daycare? Are you going to, is it a good environment and so forth? And so it can sort of have, different consequences either way. Now, in this case, it seems like family income went down. And so that's, that's certainly in line with these policies that have found that extra income from things like the EITC improves kids' outcomes.
So I just have like hypothesis trying to just reconcile your series. So maybe it's a crazy idea. So yeah, so I think you made a point. So I mean, the mother may becomes less attentive to their kids. So it could be the case again. So this largely depending on how we finance this reform. You just think about, so if this reform was financed by either like cost shifting or tax, what that means is that's going to mean, so for majority of the women, so in the labor force, they are going to bring home a lower wage. So if they bring home a lower wage, and then they probably need to work a little bit harder. If they work a little bit harder and over time, so they are going to spend less time with their children. So, so in that sense, you are going to have this virtuous cycle. So yes, this policy is going to benefit who is actually expecting a baby in the short term. But however, so this is at the cost of the rest of the population, either already have a baby or, you see what I'm saying? So this, again, this just circle back to earlier discussion we had. So Larry Summers, so basically says, so this is like a mandated benefit. Not everybody value the things the same, right? So this is one thing that I'm trying to say. The other things I want to say is in Europe, so you know what, beside this paid leave, they have another very, you can say strange, but I would say it's very interesting policy towards childcare. So in Switzerland and in Germany, so they have a policy. So they designed a policy such that give the parents, at least one of the parents, incentive to stay at home through tax. So basically, so if you have a two-wage earner, and then your tax rate is going to increase substantially. On the other hand, so if you send your kids to the daycare, and then so the cost can be like crazy. So when I was in Switzerland, like one day, so we sent our son to daycare. One day, the cost is like 190 Swiss franc, close to $200. The reason why they do that is they want to give you incentive to stay with your kid, and they believe that's the best way to educate a kid. So what I'm trying to say is, so to summarize, so in the short term, so you have this policy benefit who is going to expecting a baby. And on the other hand, in the long run, so you're going to squeeze the other part or maybe bigger population. And so in Europe, maybe the policy becomes more effective in the sense, so they have another stick waiting for you if you don't spend too much time on, if you don't spend enough time with the child, so you're gonna subject this tax penalty. That does make sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd never heard of that policy in Switzerland. I hear people talk about,
yeah, not only Switzerland, in Germany,
so that people will go to work. Sorry.
So I guess so the primarily this is in Germany. So Switzerland, just the country is just too small to talk about this policy. Like Germany, so I mean, so literally knows a lot of people is discouraged to go to work because they know, so if we have like two-wage earner, the tax rate is just so high. And so this tax rate is just on purpose designed to dissuade you to work when your kids are very young. It's not like in US, okay, so you will have like this progressional tax just for income inequality. So they have this flavor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, so
Can
I guess
I
I'm
ask a
gonna
question?
stop. Yeah, I'll stop here. Sorry.
Hey, I have a couple questions for you about this.
Yeah.
Um, so when I was when you were presenting, one of the things that I thought about was who would benefit from this policy, right? So if you enact a legal requirement, right? Like we think about these as being binding, right? But not everybody's being bound by this, right? Some people have already cleared that threshold. You know, some firms choose, you know, they say their employees are valuable enough that they want to offer all sorts of amenities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the people who are already getting amenities are probably people with higher incomes, higher education levels, these less replaceable people like you were talking about a few graphs before this one. Um, so when this policy becomes binding, it's most likely binding on low skill, low wage jobs. And if
Mm-hmm.
it's binding on low skill, low wage jobs, you would expect to see lower college attendance after this policy because those are people who are less likely to have children who attain higher educational levels, but all of a sudden have a way to have children where they couldn't have afforded to before because they have parental leave.
Hmm.
And so
That's
I
very
wonder if
interesting.
that's a confounding factor here because
Mm-hmm.
it explains a lot of these weird things that we're seeing here with like the effective paid leave because it would be binding on a group who would naturally have lower education levels.
That's a great point. Thanks. So yeah, so that's a great point. I mean, I think that would be actually a very interesting outcome, right? I have looked at fertility, and I don't see anything really going on there. But I haven't looked at, like, I don't think I've looked at differential fertility sort of by education level, which I think is maybe the kind of maybe a sort of test that would be motivated by what you're saying. Does that sound right? Like the educational attainment of the average mom giving birth to a new child, where you might expect to see sort of a compositional change among new mothers, right?
Yeah,
That,
I mean, just like you wouldn't expect, you know, university professors to respond in any way, shape, or form to a minimum wage increase. You might not expect women who are in jobs where their benefits already cover this to respond to the sudden availability of paid leave for other individuals. And
yeah,
so I just think there might be a selection uh, happening there that's kind of masked by what these larger changes are doing. And
yep,
on the employment side, I wonder if you know, you talked about there not being any change in employment levels.
mm-hmm.
It makes me think of the research on like minimum wage effects, right? And there's very little evidence that minimum wage increases change employment levels as well. And so, given that, um, I wonder if maybe you know, this is just a policy that kind of counterbalances some sort of like monopsony or market power on the part of firms, where it's something they choose not to do because they are able to restrict pay to employees, and this is a way to balance that back out through legal requirements.
Mm-hmm.
That one I have a lot less evidence for, but it was just a thought I had.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point too, and I think that's and I think that's consistent sort of with what we see there, right? Like, well, yeah, because I mean, in specifically, it certainly looks like they're basically these, to the extent these are monopolistic firms, they're sort of passing along. I mean, this would happen in monopoly as well as in a perfectly competitive environment, I think, where they would sort of just pass this along to workers, I believe. Maybe I'm not thinking about that right. I'll have to, but
I mean, if it's a perfectly competitive market, then they would pass it along to the workers, right? If it
mhm.
if you had a monopsony type event where you had, you know, few consumers of labor, then they would have artificially driven down the price of labor in their market,
Yep.
and these types of legal requirements would force them to increase the wage close, you know, just like we would do with price regulations on a power monopoly
Right.
like that. And
Right.
so, uh,
Right. Yeah. And the complication is I see only your hourly wage, right? I don't see like the wage that we're thinking of, that you think of when you think about the monopolist, is like the all-encompassing wage, right? Like including, but this is, yeah, uh,
just a
yeah,
thought.
That's a great thing. I'll have to think about that more. I think that's a great point.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thanks. Appreciate it.
Hey, Brendan, I have a question.
Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. Just in the way that you're measuring the hourly wage, how much of the effect, or can you tell how much the effect is due to, I mean, if somebody takes this disability insurance, you take the payments, then for some 6-8 week period, you're only getting 2/3 of your salary or 2/3 of your pay. So is there a long-term effect on that, or when they come back, are they back to their same hourly wage, or can you tell that how much of that drop in hourly wage is due to the fact that some people are working at a reduced wage for some period of time?
Yeah, well, so let's see. So I think the first or the last part there, I don't think any of the wage decrease or shouldn't come from that. This is because this is this measurement comes from the May and the outgoing rotation group files, where they ask specifically, what's your hourly wage? So I'm not dividing earnings by hours worked or anything like that. Although
that answers the question. That's more the question. Yeah. So it's not a wage derived from hours work and then salary. It's what your actual payment is, what your actual hourly wage is.
That's right. Although when I do this with the March CPS, I get something. I get very similar results, similar magnitude and everything. But the other thing that comes into play here is that, again, I'm looking at all women, and so at any given point in time, the fraction of those women who are, have a new child or are on leave is quite small. So I think the effect would be pretty small, even in the case where I'm using this March CPS. I believe. Does that sound right?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, so do we have more questions? If not, then wish everyone has a great weekend. Thank you so much for your coming.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. It's really great to meet you all, even though it's by Zoom, and but hopefully we'll see each other more.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks again.
Yeah. Okay, very good. So you have some time?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to chat a bit more?
Yeah. Okay. I think it's
Do you want me to stop sharing?